Review before we have Nicole and Chris take over for Mondo ID, just to discuss with you why it's so important to get these disease entities and IDs. And so really talking about how we define a disease entity and how we in ClinGen use Mondo for our gene curations. So many of you may be familiar with this, but I know that we have a lot of new biocurators, but especially for gene curation expert panels, how we were starting, we really wanted to look at how we can define a disease entity. Why this was important, not only for gene, but when we think of variant curation, as well as going into actionability and possibly dosage, is the fact that we know genes can be associated with multiple disease entities, phenotypes, and or phenotypic features. And so when we are really looking over the types of evidence and literature, it is really important for us to assess and understand what is the disease entity. Are any of them distinct from each other? And so we formed this lumping and splitting working group that really brought together clinicians, laboratorians, and nosologists to come up with guidance. And so we did. We ended up coming up with 4 criteria. This is listed on the Lumping and Splitting Working Group webpage. And all of you for gene curation, at least, are required to go through this lumping and splitting process. But what you can do is see here those 4 criteria. And what this figure really indicates, because there are 4, is it really is a balance of these criteria. So as an expert panel, both biocurators and experts should really come through and look at the different types of evidence and be able to weigh whether there is a lump or split. And this really determines the number of curations and everything else. And we'll go through a little bit more of why this is important. So again, why do we want to define that? Because understanding this entity will guide the curation. It helps groups to establish which evidence can or should be included or scored or excluded. And this is really based on the specific information known about the relationship between that gene and disease entity. So this is really important when we think about, gene disease relationships in these classifications, what evidence you actually include and score. And that's going to be based on the disease entity overall that you choose. Furthermore, and why it's in bold yellow letters is because the chosen disease entity that you have is what is going to appear with your classification on your gene disease relationship classification, your variant interpretation, as well as any reports that are on the ClinGen website. So this is ultimately the term that is going to be presented out to the public when they are looking at these different reports. And currently right now, gene variant and actionability curations associate a monarch disease ontology to the final published reports. And so Nicole and Chris will go over just how they developed this disease ontology, among other ones, in the process for how we can engage in making Mondo IDs. And so really for our group and our purposes for curation, and this is specifically for gene, but again, it could have impacts other places, is that how would you define that disease entity? And we have come up with in the Lumping and Splitting Working Group a pre-curation process. Many of you have reviewed this and already do this process within your groups. And it's really where you bring in all the evidence based on the disease or phenotypes associated with the disease. Or a gene, and it's a high level view of that. You look at those molecular mechanisms, the phenotypes and the inheritance pattern, and really begin to assess whether or not there are one lumped broad entity to be included or whether there are actual distinct entities that need to be split off for separate curations. We do want to note that this information is really important for pre-curation because we also help to associate OMIM phenotype numbers with the Mondo ID, which is captured in our gene tracking system, also called the gene tracker. So many of you know for the gene curation, our current workflow is to perform that pre-curation and that all-important obtaining the Mondo ID. And then you would go to enter this required pre-curation to the gene tracker and the GCI. And so again, that process of pre-curation facilitates expert panels reviewing Mondo and choosing currently available disease entities. So those are ones that would be already established within Mondo. You also have the ability to refine available disease entities, and we'll go through an example of that, in which case that you may agree with the particular entity and its definition, or you may want to update the nomenclature and or definition so that whatever is published on our website is similar to what the expert panel would like. And also the last one is defining new entities. When you're in a group and you find that there is an appropriate disease nomenclature currently available, we actually have a way to develop new disease entities. And again, ultimately that Mondo ID is required to start a curation record in the GCI. And that's why it's really important to review this process of the defining disease entity and obtaining that ID. It's also required to interpret the pathogenicity of a variant in the VCI. And as I said, the ACI, the Actionability Curation Interface, also supports Mondo IDs. Much of this is so that we can be able to harmonize all of these reports on our final ClinGen website. And so just as an example, as we indicated, that Mondo ID required for a gene curation record, we also have those on interpretations within a variant in a specific gene. And the Actionability Knowledge Repository in ACI shows how we can add Mondo IDs for those final reports. And so just to give some examples, here is an example of an established disease entity when we look at the fact that there's an FBN1 with Marfan syndrome curation. This is what you would see on the website, and it clearly lays out the disease entity and the Mondo ID associated, as well as that final classification. When we look again over at Mondo through the OLS lookup system, we can see the name, that Mondo ID, and this established definition. These are different points that your groups can look over to assess, again, is this appropriate? Do you want to update the disease nomenclature? There are synonyms as you look through this Mondo page, as well as that definition. And they also give provenance to the individual that provided that definition. Here's an actual example of a refined disease entity. So this is an entity that was already established as part of Mondo that has several different synonyms, but the expert panel really felt, based on the evidence that they went through, it needed to have an updated terminology or nomenclature. And so they went through as an expert panel and provided this new updated entity. And you can see that ClinGen was associated with that. Not only did they bring in this nomenclature, but brought in a really good definition of this terminology here. And lastly, we have had groups where we've actually had to develop a new nomenclature. And so this is an example from the Intellectual Disability and Autism GSEP, in which case there were several genes that they found may end up being within a complex neurodevelopmental disorder. And so this group and the CDWG came together to actually establish this and what the definition is here. And so you have the ability to do each one of these with a collaboration and working with Mondo. And Nicole will go over some of that later on in her presentation. And then finally, I just want to let you know that the Lumping and Splitting Working Group, you can visit this webpage to see all of the current guidance that we have for defining a disease entity, the pre-curation information, examples, and video tutorials. I do want to let you all know that we are currently working on guidance for disease nomenclature. We understand that this is a very large question where groups want guidance and how you would name diseases. So for any questions your groups may have on naming diseases, just please contact us through our email. But I'm very happy to turn this over to Nicole now and Chris to review Mondo and all of the great work they've done.
Thanks, Courtney. So yeah, I will share my screen and see this. Oops. Can you guys see the proper view?
I see like two.
Oh, you see both? I'll just close this one. No, you see it properly?
Yes.
Interview? Okay. I thought this would be like more. Okay, so yeah.
Still see it within a web browser, but maybe that's the best we can do.
Yeah, it's weird. Let me see if
I think it's fine though. Mm-hmm.
There we go. That's better. Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to give you, Chris and I will give you an overview of Mondo in more detail. So yeah, first starting with an overview of Mondo, and then talk about places where you can view Mondo. I'll give you some an overview of the website and more details about the content that's in the website. And then we're going to go through in pretty good detail about kind of best practices for making new term requests and requesting changes to Mondo. And we'll discuss gene-based names as well, and some of the nomenclature like Courtney mentioned. and also give you an overview of the timeline of how long it takes to make changes in Mondo. And one thing I want to point out is that as we've developed Mondo, we've kind of gone through different iterations of how it's named and how we describe it. We've gone from calling it the monarch disease ontology. We decided we didn't want to include monarch in the name because it's more of a community resource. It's not just monarchs ontology. So we're now just calling it Mondo disease ontology, as it, what's the name it said here? Yeah, so it's Mondo disease ontology, and we're spelling it now just capital M with lowercase. So just title case, no longer with the D-O capitalized at the end. So we kind of gone through a bunch of iterations of how we named it and didn't really tell anyone. So we're just telling everybody as we go along. So so Mondo was developed as part of the Monarch Initiative. This is initially how it came about. And the Monarch Initiative, in case you're unfamiliar, is a project that we've been working on for, gosh, like 6 years or so now. We've had this grant for a really long time. And the purpose of Monarch is to be able to aggregate data from model organisms in order to help inform diagnosis for human diseases. So the Monarch database contains a lot of information about diseases and the underlying phenotypes and genotypes that are implicated in these diseases, and it's able to connect this information across different species using model organism data. So if you are interested in looking at Monarch, and there's a bunch of tooling that's available with Monarch as well, the URL is here at the bottom of the screen. But Monarch, all the underlying data in Monarch is represented using ontologies. So in case you're unfamiliar with ontologies, let me just give you a brief overview. So an ontology is formally described as a knowledge classification of a particular domain or area of knowledge, where the relationships between the concepts are formally classified and defined, both in a human readable format and in a logical computer readable format. So just one quick example of a non-disease ontology is, an example here. This is from another presentation I saw at a conference a few years ago, where someone was describing ontologies, and the example they used was a swantology, an ontology of swans. So, so if we had a swantology here, we could see that, like in Mondo, terms are meant to represent all the different areas that represent aspects of swans in this case. So, and then the terms are kind of hierarchically classified. We have the subsection relationships between the terms. So like if we look at the terms here, we see like a swan is a type of bird. And then the relationships between the terms are also defined. So some other aspects of swans is that they have webbed feet, which are part of the swan, and the web foot is a foot. So we have these kind of different classifications between the terms, and the web feet are capable of swimming behavior. And we can also use ontology terms in an interoperable way. So in this example here, we have terms that are coming from different ontologies, like the NCBI taxonomy, which is actually a taxonomy, not ontology, and then the Uberon ontology, which is anatomy, and a gene ontology, which represents biological processes, amongst other things. So some of the key features of ontologies is that we have this formal classification of knowledge where the relationships and semantics are defined, which allow for logical inference and sophisticated data queries like we perform in Monarch, and which you're getting in ClinGen by mapping to the Mondo ontology. And this URL at the bottom is a list of resources that might be helpful to you if you're interested in learning more about ontologies. It has links to tutorials and other articles and blog posts that have a lot of really good information if you're interested in learning more. And as far as just different types of vocabulary types, ontologies are the most sophisticated in terms of semantic precision, but also take the most time and money to create. As those of you who've worked with us on Mondo know, there's a lot of time and effort that goes into building a resource like Mondo. And we're really grateful to have you all contributing and helping build this resource out. And I think it's been a really valuable and worthwhile effort. So a little bit of background as to why did we build Mondo? So there already existed a lot of different disease terminologies, but a lot of them were very specialized and focused on specific areas. So there might be a terminology like the National Cancer Institute thesaurus that has a really good representation of cancer and neoplasms. Or like the online Mendelian Inheritance of Man has really nice descriptions and representations of rare diseases that are Mendelian type diseases. But for Monarch, we needed a terminology or ontology that spanned these multiple categories and kind of aggregated all these together. And we needed a systematic way of relating these concepts to each other. And so a lot of these terminologies actually do have mappings to each other where they say this term is equivalent to another term. So say like a cancer term in NCIT might have a mapping to like the disease ontology, say this breast cancer term is the same as the breast cancer term in the disease ontology. And you can use these mappings to kind of crosswalk between the different ontologies. So in theory, we could have just integrated all these different disease terminologies into Monarch and then use these mappings to kind of crosswalk between them. But one of the problems that we ran into in trying to do this is that there's not always a consistent way of doing the mappings to each other. So sometimes a term might be mapped to another term, but it may not necessarily mean that they're equivalent. There could be just kind of they're related to each other, but they're not exactly equivalent. Or they could have there may not be one-to-one equivalence where one term is mapped to more than one term, another mapped to more than two terms or something. And then the proliferation of mappings can get really huge too, where you can have n to an infinite number of mappings, and then it ends up with this big tangled web, and it's really hard to interpret. So an effort that Chris and other members of our group did was to write this paper to kind of do a census of disease ontologies. And this is just for your reference. So they looked at all the disease ontologies and terminologies that currently existed and kind of did some curation and a review of these to determine what kind of information already existed. And what they found is that with all the disease terminology that existed, there was no one terminology or ontology that really fit the bill that covered all the spans of diseases that we wanted to represent in Monarch across all the different organisms and different species. So yeah, there was a wealth of disease resources, but a lot of them are specialized, like OMIM, which covers Mendelian diseases, or many of them are maybe too generalized, like MESH or SOMED. And there wasn't a single resource that was sufficient. And they also did this really nice table from the paper. They did an assessment of the different types of information that was contained in each different terminology. And this was looking at Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and pancreatic cancer, for examples. And they found that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the different terminologies, with like whether they have definitions available, the types of synonyms that they're including, the mapping to other diseases. So this is kind of some of the impetus to create Mondo, and that we wanted to kind of create a merged and coherent resource that covered everything in a more consistent way. So Chris did this really innovative approach to create Mondo, where he took a bunch of existing disease resources, and these are most of the original sources that were seeded into Mondo. A lot of these are relevant to you, like Orphanet and OMIM and GARD. These contain a lot of diseases that are similar to some of the things that you guys are looking at. He took these original sources and used this algorithmic approach with this algorithm called KBOOM, where it kind of looks at the probability of how similar these terms are to each other and if they're equivalent to each other. We went through this algorithmic approach to initially seed the ontology, and then we did a bunch of iterative manual curation over the ontology to say, okay, yes, I agree with KBOOM's assessment here, and no, I think this is wrong, and we manually curated it. Went through a few iterations of this, and then now we are 100% manually curating Mondo. So, so how Mondo was created was that using this algorithm, it kind of decided whether these terms were equivalent or not. And now we use these explicit logical axioms to define the axioms for, define the database cross-references for Mondo. So all the Mondo terms now have their own Mondo, all the terms of Mondo have their own Mondo ID, but they also have provenance or XREFs, database cross-references to the source ontologies. And these are strictly defined in that either they are defined as an equivalent term. So if we have the term mucopolysaccharidosis type 1, we have it's either equivalent to an underlying source. So this one in the ontology in itself in the OWL web language, we say equivalent to, but it shows up in OLS as an exact match. So this is an exact match to this NCIT term and to this orphanet term, or we have related to and the ontology itself, or OLS, it shows up as a close match. So it's a close match to the SNOMED term or this mesh term. So all of the terms in Mondo have their own IDs and they have a source where they came from. And, or I shouldn't say all the terms, because some of the new terms that we've added, like from your group, don't necessarily have exercise back to the underlying ontologies, but all the initial terms that were brought into Mondo have some kind of provenance back to the original source. So we started Mondo Chris started Mondo back in 2016 with this automated approach. And for the first 2 years, this was kind of the approach we were taking to run this algorithm and then to do some manual curation steps and then kind of iterate on that. And then a couple of years ago, we had a first proper release of Mondo where it was released as a distinct curated ontology. And now we just do this manual approach. So we're not running the algorithm anymore, but just going through adding new terms as I requested, like from your group, or we're doing a tons of iteration on what's already in there, trying to improve what we have. But today we have over 20,000 disease classes and more are being added continually. We've had over 2,000 issues reported on our GitHub, which is really impressive, which just speaks to like how much community feedback we've been getting, and it's been really fantastic. And yesterday I ran a release. I think it was the 52nd release of Mondo. So that was also very exciting. So yeah, we've been doing a ton of work on it, and I would say it's going extremely well. And it's been really great to have all this community involvement as well. So some other key points about Mondo, like I mentioned, every term has a Mondo ID, no matter what the source was. So if it comes from, originally the term comes from Mesh, or if it comes from NCIT, it gets a Mondo ID. We don't retain the original IDs, but we do track them in the provenance. So everything is properly attributed, but just every term has a Mondo ID. We use a standard ontology engineering practices. So we're interoperable with other ontologies like the cell ontology, human phenotype. We spend a lot of time co-developing with them to make sure we're properly aligned. We are periodically aligning and syncing with the existing resources. Like, for instance, OMIM, we've been trying to formalize and define our workflows for re-ingesting OMIM. We were hoping to get it onto like a monthly basis where we ingest the OMIM to get all the new terms in and align with the changes that they make in Orphanet and all the other source ontologies. And right now we're on a monthly release cycle. And I think a lot of you may have got, if you're on the Mondo users list, you're receiving emails from me with the announcements about the releases. And I'm currently doing the releases, and I'm aiming to do them around the first of the month. But I just want to point out too that if there's an urgent need to get some terms in and you need the ontology to be released, Chris and our colleague Nico have set up really nice workflows that are quite simple to do. So if you need something urgently, please let me know and I'd be happy to run a patch release in between. Like yesterday was an off-schedule release because we had an urgent need, so it was no problem for me to run an additional release. So a bit about the Mondo community. So as you know, the primary place that I recommend looking for Mondo terms is the ontology lookup service. This is if you haven't already used it, this is a really nicely done website that integrates a lot of different, like hundreds maybe, of ontologies from different sources, and it provides a really nice search interface where you can search on terms. It does a good job of searching on synonyms and retrieving the terms that you need. The OBO Foundry is not necessarily a place where you could necessarily see Mondo, like look up the terms, but if you want to find more information out about Mondo, this is a good site to look at for kind of some of the metadata and descriptions of Mondo. I also point you to where you can like download the actual like OWL files or OBO files or JSON. And if you're familiar, I'm sure a lot of you have already been to GitHub for reporting issues, but also all the code and the underlying files are stored up on GitHub. So if you have any interest in downloading the OWL files or the OBO files, you can download those from GitHub and view them in Protege. anybody wants to learn more about doing that, I'd be happy to schedule separate sessions and show you how to view in Protege. Personally, my favorite way to look at Mondo is in Protege. I find it a lot simpler. Once you become familiar with it, it's just easier to look at the classifications. So if anyone wants any training on how to do that, just viewing it is very simple. Yes, like we said, Mondo is a community developed effort, and we have weekly recurring calls on Fridays at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern, and those are open to everybody. So if anyone had any interest in coming and listening in on how we develop our ontology, or if you have any specific questions and wanted to run them by us, this would be a great time. Otherwise, I'm happy to join other calls as needed with your working groups to help provide feedback and such. And we have a mailing list, and if you're not on the mailing list, if you go to this link, I think you can request to join or just send me an email and I'll be happy to add you. It's not too much traffic. I send out emails when we do the releases, and I also send out emails when we are considering obsoleting terms from Mondo. So just to keep everybody in the loop. So we don't want to obsolete terms that people are using. So we want to email them to the list to get feedback before we execute on that. So if you're not already aware, we have a website, and the URLs at the bottom of most of these slides. And the website contains a lot of useful data. So the landing page kind of has the about and description of Mondo, but there's a few key pages on here that I would like to point out to you that I think might be of particular interest to you all. So we have a frequently asked questions page, and I try to keep this up to date and add, as I get questions, I try to add them here. So if someone else if you have a question, maybe someone else does too. So I try to put them up here. So I have some questions on here, like, how often is Mondo released? Like I just told you, it's on the 1st of each month. There's one question I get a lot too is, okay, now that Mondo releases out, when can I see it in OLS? And so it says on the FAQ page, if I could scroll down, if it was live, it says on there that the OLS picks up Mondo about 7 days after the release. So that's one other question. So information about how to create GitHub tickets, and I'm going to go into that with you in detail. And there's more information on here that you might find useful. So I suggest that you just take a look here and see if there's any questions you might have that maybe already answered. And then we also have this contributors page. And one thing I want to point out is that on the contributors page, we have a list of all the people like yourselves who've been contributing. And I don't think I have it up to date with all the ClinGen curators. So if you're not listed on here, could you please let me know, and I will add you to this page. Even if you have written one ticket, you're a contributor, and I would love to include you on here. But also on the contributors page, if you click on it, at the top of the page, it has a link to this page that I've highlighted here on how to make a good term request. So if you are going to Mondo's GitHub site and you want to request how to make request a new term, this page has some guidelines for you on there. And I'm going to go into detail today too about some best practices. But I just want to emphasize too, best practices are only just guidelines. Like if any term request is fine. If we have any questions, we'll just ask you, and don't feel that it has to be perfect. We definitely appreciate any contributions. No judgment. but there is this page here linked from the contributors page on how to make a good term request, just FYI. Okay, so next I want to get into a little bit more of the kind of underlying design of Mondo. So this is a little bit more technical. So we have these design patterns that are used to specify how the Mondo terms are constructed. And this is not by any means super strict or something that you have to follow, but this is just kind of also kind of a guideline that how we would like to have the terms constructed in Mondo. So we have all these patterns. They're called dead simple ontology design patterns. And these were these were designed by our colleague, David Asumi Sutherland. And I love that the acronym for this includes David's initials. And also you may notice that it's backwards. It's not DSO, but DOS. And the primary language that ontologies are developed in is called OWL, which is the web ontology language. So that's also a backwards acronym. And so that's kind of a nod to the OWL and to David Asumi Sutherland, who developed these. So for computer programmers, this is a very simple kind of language. It's called YAML, where we basically have these patterns that specify how the terms should be created for groups of terms that are similar to each other. So I'm just going to go through this one example that's most relevant to all of you. So this is the disease series by gene pattern. So so these pre-made patterns will specify certain aspects of the term. So when you have a new term, if we add a new term to Mondo, all the terms have to have a label. They also have to have a definition, and they don't have to have synonyms, but having synonyms can be extremely helpful for helping with searching and retrieval of the information. And then the patterns also specify the logical definition, but I grade this out because this is something that we wouldn't expect any of you to be able, to write for us. But just for our development purposes, this is helpful because it helps create the logic that goes behind the terms, so we can do reasoning and inferencing over the terminologies. But for your purposes, what I'd like to go over with you is how the patterns can specify the labels, the text definitions, and the synonyms. So this is what the pattern would look like. So if you go to this link at the bottom of the screen, and this will take you to the directory of all the patterns that we have. And then if you click on a pattern like this one, the disease series by gene, this is exactly what the YAML looks like. It's cut off, it's like way longer than this. But at the very top, you can see there's a description. So this is saying what this pattern is about. So, so this one is for describing genes that are caused by single mutations in a gene, like that have gene-based names. And I also mentioned you all specifically, like the terms that you request in ClinGen. And then we also have some examples. So these are some terms I think came from ClinGen curators, MedGen related intellectual disability, and so on. And then these bits you can kind of ignore. They're saying that in each term, we're going to be using these classes and these relationships, and this is for specifying the logical definitions for these terms. But then the vars is important. These are the variables that will be used in this term. And then each time you see a little percent sign in S, this is a variable is kind of slotted in here. So I'm going to go into more detail and kind of break this down more in the next slide. Okay, so this is just another copy of what I just showed you before, just in breaking it down more. So basically what we can do with these patterns is that we can create new terms in a consistent way. So we have these variables, disease and gene. So basically we want to make a term that's called MED12 related intellectual disability syndrome. The disease would be intellectual disability syndrome and the gene would be MED12. And then same with these other examples. If we had TTN related myopathy, the disease would be myopathy and the gene would be TTN. And same with MYPN related myopathy. We also have the disease is myopathy and the gene is MYPN. So I think this is pretty simple. So basically we're just taking these different variables and slotting them into the different slots. So we have the specification for how the disease should be named. So this would be, since we know what the variables are, we have myopathies and a gene. This name would be automatically created to be myopathy caused by a mutation in MYPN. And then we can also specify the synonyms. So the synonym would say, so this would be a gene and then a disease. So this would be MYPN myopathy. And here's a couple, or one more synonym example. So, and I know ClinGen curators often ask for the term names in this format. So I added this as another synonym. And this is a question that maybe we can talk about at the end is, do we have to name the terms myopathy caused by mutation in MYPN, or is it okay to name the term MYPN related, oops, I have a typo here, synonym. I should be say MYPN related myopathy here. And then, yes, and then it also specifies how the diseases should be named. So any myopathy in which the cause of the disease is mutation in the MYPN gene. So we can do this by an automated process, or we can also just manually do this, but it's also nice to consult these patterns in order to make sure that if we're adding a new term, if it conforms to a pattern, that we're using the patterns just to make sure all the terms in Mondo are represented in a consistent way. So I made a little screencast video here of showing you how to request a new term. So I think when all of you are going in to request new terms, we wouldn't be necessarily using the automated process using the patterns, but we'd just be doing this manually. So I made a little screencast here of how to go into the GitHub issue tracker and request new terms. So these instructions are here on the left, but I'm going to play this and describe it as I go. So if we click on issues and then click on new issue, then we see a bunch of different templates. Oh, this is going really fast. So we see a bunch of different templates. Oops. So we created these different templates in order to help just guide users like yourselves pick which type of template you need to use. If you're coming in to make a new term request, you probably have an idea like I need to request a new term or I need to request a change. We added this new template just for you all. That's to add a term about gene-related syndromes. Another thing people have done a lot in your groups have asked to obsolete terms or merge terms. So there's templates for that. If you want to ask something completely different and there's no template, if you scroll to the bottom of this page, there's a very tiny font that says, don't see the template you need, then open a blank issue. Also, if you just click on a template, you can also delete all the content that comes up too. So you don't have to use one of these templates. You can pick something else or just delete what's in there. So in this example, we're going to add a new term or request a new gene-related syndrome term. So we'll choose this template, get started. When I recorded this too, when I recorded this, I didn't know how to get rid of the sound. So if you listen to this with the sound on, you can just hear my typing in the background. But so we're going to request a new term. So then I'm just going to go through examples of just adding new term requests here. So please always include a title in this template. This template has these pre-filled content in here. For me, this is really helpful that it brings in this like heading that says new term request gene, so then I can kind of quickly go through this. Also note that the template also automatically assigns it to me, which is great because I get an email notification right away. And then it also assigns these labels by default, which is also really helpful for me just to be able to quickly visualize what kind of requests are coming in. In the video, note that I wrote the new term name here and then just copied and pasted underneath the prompts for each line. Also, I want to point out this is all written in Markdown. That's why the formatting looks kind of funny, where we have all these stars around the labels. And I didn't show you this in the video, but if you go to preview, you can see how it looks when it's actually submitted. So this first line would be bolded because of these stars. And then, so you can kind of toggle back and forth between the write and preview and see how the Markdown looks. And also I want to recommend that when you add any content in here, just do it one line below where the prompts are, then it just makes the formatting look much nicer. So yeah, so add the new term name, write in different synonyms that you would like to include. So, and these can also follow the patterns. When you add the new parent term, a lot of times it's good to look up, unless you happen to know it off the top of your head, look in OLS for the new pattern. I added some more examples here. So, and then if we want to follow the patterns, then it'd be really easy just to copy and paste out, copy and replace, or delete and replace what you want. So this is now following the pattern. When you add the PubMed, if you have a PubMed ID associated with it, one thing that's really nice, just makes it faster for me, is if there's no space in between the colon and the numbers. That's how we have to have it formatted in Mondo. And then also, we'll go into this in more detail, but to add any children terms that might be included, that might be children of the term that you're requesting. And this, I didn't want to remake the video. I realized I should have written this. If you include your ORCID ID, it's ideal if you include it as the URL, not in that format. So yeah, so that's the basics behind adding to creating new term requests. So, and that's summarized here on the left. So, and these slides will be shared with you, so you will have this information. So here's a little bit more detail about recommendations for new term requests. And I just really want to emphasize that we just really appreciate your contributions to Mondo. And these are just recommendations. This isn't by no means like a requirement, and any format or way you request a new term is absolutely fine. sometimes when when more information is provided, just makes it a little bit faster though for me, and then hopefully get your terms in more quickly without having to ask questions. So some general recommendations are, so yeah, make sure that when you make a new term request, which I think everyone really mostly does, but just make sure that there's not an existing term in Mondo. Sometimes it can be easy to miss sometimes, but so we don't always assume that you've already checked. I'll check too, but just make sure there's not an existing term or doesn't match any existing synonyms. So in that case, we wouldn't need to add the new term. And then yeah, writing a concise definition in the definition field is just really helpful. And so now I've added those guidelines with the examples for how the definition should be written, but also on this link here, this takes you to a blog post from Chris that he summarized a paper that defines on how to write good term requests. And this is a very helpful resource. And by no means do you have to feel like you have to write a perfect definition. Mondo curators will iterate on it and make sure it goes in the way it should. But just if you're interested in learning more about how to write definitions, this is a very helpful resource. And then another thing is that for Mondo, for all the synonyms, we try to always include a database cross-reference to the definitions and the synonyms. And I think this is never really an issue with ClinGen, but just so you know. So yeah, I think always the ClinGen requests always have PubMed IDs referencing them, and I use those to reference the synonyms too. But if in the case you were requesting like new synonyms to a term, we just want to make sure we have proper references to the synonyms. And then yeah, so a lot of times, sometimes we get requests for new gene-related disorders, and then in some cases, some of the existing OMIM classes are suitable to be children of those terms. So I'll give you more examples of that later, but we definitely recommend, if you're asking for like a gene-related term, if you check OMIM2 to see if there's other diseases that have mutations in those genes, and maybe those would be suitable children for the new term that you're requesting, is something that would be great to check. And then these things are just really low priority, but formatting things that just make it a little bit more, facilitate my curation efforts in getting these terms into Mondo. So everything in Mondo is lowercase, the labels and the synonyms, unless it's a proper term or like a name or abbreviation. So like if you had a gene name related myopathy, then obviously the gene name would be capitalized, but otherwise the term labels should be lowercase. And if you write the prompts in the template, write one line below, like I pointed out before, then the markdown formatting will display properly. So the term labels and the synonyms should be lowercase. And then, like I mentioned, the PubMed ID format there should be no space between the colon and the number. And then if you could also include the Mondo ID and the label for the parent term, or even if only one thing, the ID is ideal, just so there's no ambiguity as to what the parent term should be. And then if you could list the children terms with the ID and label in a bulleted list, and then markdown just need to do a dash space and then the term, then that just makes it easier for me to copy and paste out of there. Okay, so, and then this is an article if you want to get even more into learning about how to write ontology definitions. This is an article that's published a few years ago by some of the leaders in the ontology field with guidelines for writing definitions and ontologies. And this gets into a lot of detail, but this is really just to show you that there's been a lot of thought that's gone into this. And the development ontologies is a very detailed and very rigorous process. So if you just want to take a peek at this paper and get kind of an idea of some of the thought and deliberations that have gone into how to write good definitions and ontologies, this is a good resource to look at. Okay, so yeah, so gene-based names. So there was a question, are we able to, should ClinGen be requesting gene-based names? I know I've been on some calls with ClinGen and OMIM folks. I know some of the OMIM folks aren't a big fan of the gene-based names. They like to, so as maybe you already know that an OMIM, if they have a new disease that, if they have a disease that is represented by certain phenotypes, and then they find a new gene that's implicated in that disease, rather than giving a gene-based name, they give it a number. So if they had dystonia. This actually seems like could be incorrect, but so if they had a term that was dystonia with a mutation in a certain gene, and then they found a new disease that had the same phenotypes but different gene, they would call it dystonia 1, dystonia 2, etc., to dystonia 5. But in ClinGen, you all tend to name things based on the gene that's implicated. So just one thing that, we'd like to point out is that this is totally fine. We're able to accommodate the gene-based names. We just want to make sure that we have the proper classifications in Mondo, and we can do this a lot through some of our the logic that goes into Mondo. So this is a ClinGen term, the GTP cyclohydrolase 1 deficiency, and then these are OMIM terms that are classified under this term because they all have this dysfunction in the GCH1 gene. So based on some of the logic that goes into the ontology, some of these can get automatically inferred, but we just, when you're requesting new terms, if you want to check OMIM to see if there's other terms that have implications in the same gene, and then if you want to help try to identify genes or identify classes that should also be children of the gene of the term that you're requesting, that's just very helpful. And then I was asked to talk about the different synonym types. So this is kind of a busy slide with a lot of content, but I'll try to go through this in detail. Also, I put this up on our documentation. So if you follow this link at the bottom, you can see these descriptions also on our website and our documentation. That's for editors. So we have 4 different types of synonym scopes, and then we also have a bunch of different synonym types. I just included a couple of the synonym types here below. But first I'll go over the synonym scopes. So when requesting a synonym, it has to conform to one synonym scope. So it either could be exact, narrow, broad, or related. So I think a lot of cases, probably most of the synonyms you might be requesting are probably exact. So that's an exact match where the name of the meaning of the synonym means exactly the same thing as the label. It's just another way of saying it. So an example would be saying hereditary versus familial. A narrow synonym would be a more specific term, and sometimes narrow synonyms is questionable, like maybe we should just add a new term, but sometimes maybe a new term isn't really needed or maybe not be used enough to warrant creating a new term. So a narrow synonym would be a more specific term than the term itself. So for example, a narrow synonym for asthma would be exercise-induced asthma. So not all asthma is exercise-induced, but exercise-induced asthma is a type of asthma. So and then conversely, we have broad synonyms, which are more general, like autoimmune hepatitis. Let's just say broad here. A broad synonym would be autoimmune liver disease. So disease is more broad than specific liver inflammation. And then related synonyms. So related synonyms are used, I think, maybe a bit overused in Mondo. A lot of synonyms have gone automatically into Mondo as related, but sometimes I think that maybe they should actually be exact. So we're definitely working through these and trying to improve the representation of synonym scopes in Mondo. But especially when requesting new terms, if you want to think about, so related synonyms would be synonyms that are used synonymously with the primary term in the literature, but the usage isn't strictly correct. But we add these as something that if we think people might be searching on the synonym with the hopes of finding this term, we want to add the synonym in order to improve the retrieval of the term that they're looking for. So example would be AGAT deficiency. Related synonym would be disorder of glycine aminotransferase activity. So these aren't exactly the same thing, but maybe kind of similar meanings. And then also in Mondo, you might come across instances where we either have excluded or deprecated synonyms. So we've excluded some synonyms where we no longer want the synonyms to be used. So like a lot of terms that we brought in automatically had the specification of NOS or not otherwise specified. We didn't want to include that in Mondo, so we just excluded those synonyms. or if there's a synonym in Mondo where it's no longer relevant, but we want to keep the provenance, we'll, so we don't really ever delete anything from Mondo. We want to keep all the information that's been brought in and keep the history of it. So we can exclude synonyms. We also will deprecate synonyms for terms that are no longer appropriate to be used, like mental retardation is no longer a politically correct thing to say. So we relabeled all these terms to intellectual disability, or have attempted to do so. And all the synonyms, we don't want to delete the history of them, so we marked them as deprecated. Also, example of that is some terms that have been used in like Nazi Germany that we didn't want to display in our in the release version of the ontology. Oh, and then I had a request of what should ClinGen curators do when they have more than one term to request that are kind of related to each other. So so the way I showed you the term requests, that was for a single request, but I should also point out that you can also request multiple terms on one ticket. So when I do that when I'm requesting terms to Mondo or other ontologies, I'll just make a list of the terms under each kind of heading. But also I created a spreadsheet for y'all, this template. So I shared this with everybody now. It's a view only share. So I recommend that if you want to use this, please feel free, but just open this file and then make a copy of it. And so we can preserve this as a template. But so this contains all the information that was listed in the patterns and in the templates on the issue tracker, but it's just a spreadsheet format. So it'd be much faster for folks to go in and request more if they want to request more than a few terms. Feel free to use this. I tried to add so headers, and then I tried to add some notes in the second row just to and some formatting guidelines too. So, and if you have any comments on this, please by all means give me feedback and I can iterate and make it more usable. But I love using spreadsheets, so hopefully this will help facilitate some of the bigger requests that you have, and then we can work off the spreadsheet together. So I recommend, if you want to use this spreadsheet, it's a Google Doc. So if you could just still create a ticket and just link to this Google Doc from the ticket, and then that'll be perfect. Or otherwise, feel free to just email it to me and I can also create tickets myself. And then one question that I think probably everybody has is, how long does it take to see the changes in Mondo? So I created this timeline to kind of show how the whole process works. So so we start with you all requesting new terms or new changes to Mondo via the GitHub tracker. And then, so those tickets are, the GitHub tracker is open and publicly viewable. So, so the ticket is posted and anybody can see it. Those who are watching will get notifications. And then the tickets are open, and we hope to get some expert advice and people to weigh in and any comments or suggestions on that. And then I'll go through and review the tickets. I get a notification right away when someone posts a ticket. I try to get to that as soon as possible. I honestly try to prioritize tickets that come from ClinGen and from other users over tickets that we're just posting to each other internally. So I will review that ticket and do the appropriate action, add the term or make the change. Then I create a pull request. And I have to point out that I got these icons from this website called the Noun Project, and this is really how my workflow looks like. My cat is always sitting with me. And then we create a pull request. So this is just a workflow through GitHub, which allows, so it doesn't make the changes directly into Mondo. It kind of makes them on my local copy, and then I do this pull request through GitHub, and then Chris is able to view my changes, and he will review the changes, review the term, or review the changes that I made and approve the changes. And then, so this process here in blue it's hard to say how long this will take. I would say it takes a minimum of a few days, a maximum could be months. It depends on the complexity of the term that's requested, and how long it takes for Chris and I to get to the editing and review process. So I would say, yeah, it just kind of varies, depends on the term. I also want to point out that if you need the term sooner than later, feel free to nag us. We don't mind at all. Just let us know, send an email or on the ticket, just mention me, and we can prioritize it. Unfortunately, I would love to spend all my time on Mondo, but I have other projects I have to work on too. And then, so once the term goes through this process or the changes, like I said, I release the ontology around the 1st of each month. So I'm planning to do my next release on November 2nd, Monday. That's the plan. And then, yeah, like I said before, it takes about 7 days for it to be picked up by OLS and to be displayed there. And that brings us to the end. And if you join our users list, if you're not already on there, I always send out a picture of a cat. And please send me pictures of your cat so that they can be memorialized in Mondo. This is my favorite picture where Sherry's cat is sitting in front of the computer with a picture of Sierra's cat. Yeah, so it's a great community. We like to share pictures of our cats, getting lots of great work done. And we also have some dog pictures too, these cute little puppies. Yeah, so our contact information is here. We are funded by the Monarch Initiative and recently received additional funding from for a grant called Phenomics First, which is just getting underway. And really, we couldn't do all of this without contributions from this wonderful community. And I apologize very much if anyone's name is missing here. Please let me know. And also, I need to update our website too, which I think is missing some names. So I'd love to make sure everybody is recognized for their contributions. And thank you all so much for inviting us to talk today too. We are really happy to speak with you all. And with that, I would love to take any questions. Oh, only a minute to go. So sorry, I didn't realize the timing.
That was fantastic, Nicole. Thank you so much. And we always love the cat pictures and the dog pictures. They're really great.
Great.
So, I know there were a few questions in the chat, and Chris and Courtney had answered some of those, but just
great.
as we're reaching the end, does anyone have any questions you did not get answered? Right.
I'm not sure of the full context for the last question, but yeah, happy to take any questions.
Yeah, and just to reiterate to everyone, we will be working on, please contact us at Lumping and Splitting if you have questions about what entities to pick following our guidance. And certainly we are working with having Mondo incorporated in many of our different curation activities. And so that's to points of Kate's messages that actionability is now using the Mondo IDs now for their reports. And that really just helps us to map for our purposes, our curation activities to the website. So you can see all of our reports, whether it's gene, dosage, actionability together. That's great.
And really just to emphasize as well, a lot of what, kind of Nicole presented, things like, the design patterns for Mondo, many of these were done, kind of based on kind of extensive, discussions with many of you. And we see this really as a kind of collaborative process, so this is not us kind of imposing, this is how we think diseases should be classified. This is a kind of an ongoing conversation and collaboration.
Yeah, it's really terrific, and it's just great to work with you all when we have these requests and some back and forth. So we really appreciate all of the hard work that you do, and thanks so much again for joining us today. It's been really helpful, and I will share the slides on the listserv, and look forward to working with you all some more. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Bye, everyone.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.